Japan's brutal attacks would backfire. They crippled Chiang, but they would serve as a bitter spur to far more radical Chinese nationalists. In the early 30s, young Mao Zedong had gained popularity by calling on China to unite against Japan. But Chiang Kai-shek did not want to launch a full-scale attack on the Japanese until he had crushed the communist movement. When radicals staged anti-Japanese demonstrations, Chiang's Kuomintang urged police to attack them. Lu Xun supported the communists against the Kuomintang and the Japanese.
The brave man draws his sword against the strong. The coward goes against the weak.
Taking a stand in China was suddenly a matter of life and death. Shanghai had become the battleground between the Kuomintang and the left-wing writers for the soul of China.
当然，国民党对鲁迅是恨之入骨。
The Kuomintang hated Lu Xun to the bones because no one else had such a great influence in China during the 20s and 30s. He was the only one.
为什么没有杀死他？我想，当然一个原因就是鲁迅很长时间生活在租界里。
But there were two reasons the Kuomintang didn't kill him. One, he was living in the Japanese concession. And two, killing Lu Xun would have made more people despise the Kuomintang.
造成对国民党的怨恨，恐怕对他也不利。
Lu Xun began to reach a wider audience. In speeches and newspaper articles, he assailed the Kuomintang, demanded justice for the poor, and attacked the rich and mighty.
The words of the writer must be daggers and javelins which can hew out a blood-stained path to a new life.
By the end of his life, national culture began to be equated, in his view, with proletarian culture, and thereby bring into this whole discussion an internationalist angle, namely, the downtrodden peoples of the world must unite to fight the colonialists. And he shared that view too. But at the same time, as we talked before, he had a very sort of a pessimistic view about the potential of Chinese people. The Chinese people simply did not have enough consciousness.
Hope cannot be said to exist, nor can it be said not to exist. It is just like roads across the earth. For actually, the earth has no roads to begin with. But where many people pass one way, a road is made.
For the communists, the road to hope was a long march, the name for an epic retreat by Mao and 100,000 followers begun in 1934. They escaped Chiang's armies by traveling a circular route of over 6,000 miles to Yan'an, an outpost in the mountains of North China. In Yan'an, Mao discovered a building fury in the countryside that city dwellers like Lu Xun could not see. Mao believed that Chinese peasants, silently suffering the cruelty of landlords and the Japanese, would soon erupt in revolution. Mao wrote, "They raise their blackened hands and lay them on the heads of the gentry. They alone are able to carry out the work of destruction." But in 1934, the hope that was stirring China's wheat fields had not reached China's cities. Amidst the steel and concrete, the long march was just another bitter burden, a retreat that marked the beginning of the end. In the cities, the Kuomintang used brutal methods to destroy the Communist Party. In Shanghai, the communists were forced underground. Increasingly desperate, they tried to maintain their public influence by seeking to control Lu Xun, Shanghai's most famous left-wing writer. The communists demanded that Lu Xun write what the party told him.
I always feel I'm bound in an iron chain while a foreman is whipping me in the back. No matter how hard I work, the whip will fall. When I ask, what are my thoughts? The foreman would clasp my hands, smile, and say he and I are the best of friends.
Though he was a left-wing writer, Lu Xun was not a communist. He wanted to work for a revolution, but he believed China's future depended on the freedom of writers to imagine it.
Some of the youngsters wanted to control him, and he refused. Lu Xun almost had an open break, 1935-36. And the break was so traumatic that it cost his life, in a way.
On October 19, 1936, Lu Xun died in Shanghai. In a final irony, he died of tuberculosis, just like his father. He wrote his own epitaph.
The role of the writer is to criticize. I have no sword, only a pen, and it is not for sale.
More than 10,000 people marched with Lu Xun's casket, carrying banners and shouting slogans, calling him the soul of China, whose pen was mightier than the sword. One journalist wrote, "It was different from the pain of hearing a crowd of people weeping. It was a feeling that something very big had been lost, something no force could ever bring back." In 1949, Mao Zedong triumphed over Chiang Kai-shek, and China became a communist country.
I would imagine that Lu Xun would have felt quite proud, say, around 1949, just as most of Chinese intellectuals felt very proud about China being an independent nation and all that. But look at what happened in the last 30 years or 40 years. Because what happened in China was that for a quarter of mankind, you have the imagination of one man, namely Chairman Mao. He was a genius. There's no doubt about that. But the genius of Mao became a negative factor because other intellectuals, including Lu Xun if you were alive, would not be allowed, so to speak, to imagine something different.
Lu Xun had dreamed of a China freed from stifling traditions, where people could speak for themselves. Mao's China destroyed the old traditions, but when its people spoke, it was with one voice, the voice of Chairman Mao. Today, Lu Xun remains trapped inside monuments to his memory, which have turned his writings into revolutionary slogans. In death, he serves a new China many believe he would have hated as much as the old.
After the revolution, the Communist Party promoted and trumpeted Lu Xun, even as the party purged intellectuals who dared to attack the party. It was a farce. In his writings, Mao made it clear that criticism like Lu Xun's would no longer be allowed in the Communist Party. Literary forms like the essay, new poetry, and satire would no longer be tolerated. Put simply, Mao tried to murder the influence of Lu Xun on China, but he failed.
In 1989, a democracy movement inside China gathered force in Tiananmen Square, the site of the May 4th movement 70 years before. When the government cracked down, a poem appeared on walls all over the city. If Lu Xun were alive today, his head would roll in Tiananmen Square. The imagination of the Chinese people was stifled by rulers who believe that power flows from the